Black Power, Chapter 21. I bet you're beginning to wonder if we're going to ever get out of the 1960s. But we will. By the mid 1960s, the mindset of the African Americans are changing. They're beginning to question whether having whites work with them was a good idea. And then, of course, SNCC, the Student for Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, has a new president, a Stokely Carmichael. And he's a very, very well-educated man. He has a degree in psychology. He's worked with the civil rights movement in many areas. He's well qualified. He's also a good speaker and a very attractive man. And we're beginning to see questions like, really, I'm not too sure about having the whites work with us. And what about this nonviolence? It's getting harder and harder. We need to meet violence with violence. I mean, Dr. Martin Luther King is a very good man, but he's kind of out of the loop, so to speak. He's an older type guy. And the black clenched fist becomes a symbol of black pride. And there's starting to be talk of maybe a black revolution. And the white population is getting a little fearful, where we had been so all for helping when we saw those little children get hit with the water hoses. But now we're starting to get, a little bit worried. And especially when we don't even know for sure what is meant by black power. Because the leaders really hadn't defined it. But the general public took it to mean power by the blacks. And the March on Washington, it seemed to be the end of the nonviolent movement. And even Randolph himself states that the value of an all-Negro March on Washington would have developed a sense of self-reliance among the black community. So even he is leading toward black-only participation. Enter the Nation of Islam. A man called Elijah Poole, who is also known as, or changed his name to Elijah Muhammad. And we won't go into the history of the Nation of Islam. It's really quite interesting. If you get a chance, you need to check it out. The man originally started the whole thing was a little bit cuckoo. But the message that Elijah Poole was teaching was race pride. He wanted to see black-owned businesses. He wanted self-help programs. But he really was preaching a kind of a different interpretation of Islam than they were in the other countries. One thing they had to do, they rejected any name that had any connection to the whites. They advocated total racial separation. And the most highly recognized member was Cassius Clay, also known as Muhammad Ali from Kentucky. And the most eloquent spokesperson was Malcolm Little, who changed his name to Malcolm X. And there is a very smiling Malcolm X, and I must admit I had a wide variety of pictures to choose from, but I wanted to see him smiling. When somebody isn't smiling, they look kind of mean, and he wasn't a mean man. He'd grown up and become a thief and was in prison, and when he was in prison, he learned about Islam. He also studied history and literature and religion. When he was released in 1953, he moved to Detroit, and there he met Elijah Muhammad and became a disciple, if you would. And he was a very articulate speaker, so it didn't take long before Elijah decided to make use of him. So he sent him to Boston to establish a new temple. Well, they decided to change the name from temple to mosque. The mosque has more of a Muslim connotation, where temple sounds almost Jewish. When he was speaking, and he had a beautiful speaking method about him, he told about black pride. He also told the story of how he had changed his life and turned around. And he believed that Dr. King's nonviolent movement, it had the aspect of becoming a little dangerous. But after that church bombing in Birmingham, where those little girls were killed, Malcolm was wondering, and he wrote in his book that, how is it that a black man would lay down his life and die for others in Vietnam, but he wouldn't fight for his rights in the civil rights movement? And he further said, responding to hatred with love is just, it's no use to it. It's not getting us anywhere. And Mike Wallace, a very famous television commentary, produced a documentary on the black Muslims, and he interviewed Malcolm. And he's the one that claimed that he was the antithesis of Martin Luther King. So Malcolm now has been seen on television, and he's on the radar, as I said. But, when you get right down to it, not all the civil rights workers were following Martin Luther King's plan on violence. I mean, sometimes they hadn't been through the training schools, I guess, and they would meet violence with violence, and it just created more violence. Something called the Deacons of Defense and Justice. Gee, that sounds very ostentatious. They worked with non-violent workers. They themselves most of them were former military, and they carried guns, and they had handguns, and they had walkie-talkies, and they were kind of an unofficial police force for protection. They would not start anything, but if you started something, they would finish it for you. And they were used primarily when the civil rights groups would come into town. For instance, in 1965, your text mentions that they had to rescue 2 Corps field workers in Los Angeles because they were being bombarded by angry white mob. Well, the group declares not to follow Martin Luther King strictly in the nonviolence. In other words, we'll try it, and if it doesn't work, we're going to meet violence with violence. But in 1964 is when the Deacons of Defense and Justice and other types of organization like that were formed in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And as you can see, that is the Deep South. That's where the most problems were. Robert F. Williams of North Carolina, he was president of a local branch of NAACP, and he advocated nonviolence protests, but he really believed that violence should be met with violence. And in his preaching around and talking, of course, the KKK came visiting. His house would be surrounded by threatening white crowds, and he himself, Mr. Williams, equated black manhood with a man who would protect himself and his family, not just out here protesting, carrying a sign. Well, he got so much hassle that he had to leave the town, and in '62 he moved to Cuba. But that's okay, because he went on the radio and started publishing a radio, and he actually did publish a radio. He published a newspaper. I'm sorry. He did everything he could to radicalize black students in college. He formed a group called the Revolutionary Action Movement, and I love that RAM. They had branches in Philadelphia and California, and like so many of them, and it kind of surprised me when I first read about it many decades ago, they began to move to a Marxist direction, and a lot of your civil rights groups did. Very lefty. In 1957, Guyana had become independent, and their new nation's leader, and I'm going to massacre his name, Nkrumah, he stated that the black man is capable of managing his own affairs. Now, Malcolm X had visited the Middle East and Africa in 1959. He's trying to internationalize his message of freedom and the struggle for the freedom. He stresses the message of black nationalism and the kinship with people of color everywhere in Africa or any other country. Now, Malcolm's father had been a follower of Garvey, and he didn't want integration. He wanted black separation, which is what Garvey was teaching. And at this point in time, under the Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, of course, they wanted separation. And they were taught that the white man was, devils. But between 1955 and 1965, Malcolm X started doing some thinking, and especially after his trips to the Far East. And his message began to be a little bit different. He went to Africa twice in '65, and he made pilgrimages to Mecca. Then he went on into Egypt and other Muslim countries. In July to November, he was back in Africa, where he heard Nasser of Egypt speaking, praising the American passage of the '64 Civil Rights Act. Now, before he'd gone over there, he'd formed something called the Organization of African American Unity. It was based on an African organization and was meant to foster unity, and the symbol was the Black Panther. Well, while he's over there, he's getting information from so many different sides of the Islam faith. And he comes back, he decides to break with the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad and set up his own group. Now, he's no longer that clean-cut guy, well-shaven, short haircut, and the epitome of a perfect man. His hair is longer, he's bearded. And he starts appealing directly to the African black nations to raise the issues of the civil rights movement in the U.S. in the United Nations. Because he himself feared that if something wasn't done, there was going to be a race war. Well, when he returned home from his trip to Africa in '65, his ideas had been changing. And like I said, he'd seen and actually met with white Muslims. He talked to them. And he no longer believed them to be the white devils that Elijah Muhammad had claimed that they were. Well, he cut his ties, and Elijah wasn't very happy, was a very unhappy man with Malcolm leading because he was an excellent speaker and he had done more to make the organization grow than anybody else. And he was especially angry with his change in views. So in February of '65, while he was getting ready to make a speech to the group, Malcolm was assassinated by members of the black Muslims. Did Elijah Muhammad have his fingers in it? It was never proven, but never convinced me that he didn't have his fingers in that pie. So who's going to be the heirs to his ideas? Is it going to be the Republic of New Africa? It's a group who wanted a total black nation state. Is it going to be this new party called the Black Panther Party, which, well, they were identifying with, shall we say, violent revolutions? Now, James Meredith had entered the University of Mississippi back in 1962. He graduated and he had his degree, and in '66 he was on a one-man protest march and he was shot. He didn't die, he was just wounded. So the members of SCLC, CORE, and SNCC all got together and they were going to have a march and they were going to call it Meredith March. It's at this time we're beginning to meet Mr. Carmichael. And they were met with rocks and taunts and gun-toting white men. And Carmichael was arrested, but he was released. And he's angry, and he goes back to the camp where the other marchers are, and he starts talking to them, and while he's talking, he raises his fist, and he says the magic words, Black Power. He's had it. No more nonviolence. He's had it. He's going to meet violence with violence. CORE and SNCC, they thought, they've been thinking about this for some time. Maybe we shouldn't have had the white people involved, and you can't have black power when you got white folks around, so they all kick out their white members. Now, Carmichael's writing books, and he's touting race consciousness. He wanted black-controlled schools and housing and employment in the black communities, and that's not a bad idea. But in 1968, he joined the Black Panther Party, and it didn't take him very long to become disillusioned with them either. So being disillusioned with the slow progress of the movement, he changes his name to go on a tour, and he moves to Ghana. He stayed down there till he died in 1998 of cancer. Although he's from Trinidad, he came to this country when he was about 2, I think it was. Very intelligent, educated man. But you're hearing the words black power everywhere. You're hearing it in the churches, you're hearing nuns talk about it. I mean, it's just everybody's talking about black power. And Martin Luther King, of course, hears it, and he's upset, especially with the ministers using black power in their sermons in the church. But the Black Panther Party was formed in California in 1966, and of course they were notorious. They wore the black leather jackets and the black berets. They carried guns. And in one instance, they descended on the California State Capitol to protest a proposed gun bill, and it was quite intimidating to have these men all dressed in black with guns show up. When one of their members was convicted for killing a policeman, the demonstration staged all over the country. Then they published their 10-point program, which I'm not going to go into because that's what you're supposed to do your critical analysis on, and I don't want you to be swayed by anything I say. But as a little tip, I have a little short YouTube on the Black Panthers after the lecture. There's so much information on go on to YouTube or just go onto the web, and you'd be amazed at what you find out. But their tactics, well, I thought that was kind of clever. They follow the police around, and they had these police monitors, and they'd monitor the chatter on the radio, and wherever there was an arrest, they'd go to make sure that there wasn't any police brutality. And then they start reading the penal code to citizens out loud. But they did have some community-run programs, and they offered free breakfast programs, so that they were, there was some good there. But they were extremely macho. Very male-dominated organization, even though they did have female members. They admired and quoted Mao Zedong and Che Guevara, and they glorified the Algerian Revolution and Ho Chi Minh. You've got the leader of the communists, the leader of the North Vietnam, not Korea. They denounced capitalism. They denounced the middle-class blacks. They denounced any civil rights organizations and black nationalism organizations. See, they're denouncing their own people. They called the police pigs, and they said America was Babylon from the Bible. They chanted, "The revolution has come. It's time to pick up the gun." And folks, people were terrified. And it wasn't just the whites. There was a lot of blacks that were frightened too. But the FBI took these threats seriously, and they began one of their sieges of, I guess you'd say, unconstitutional searches and harassment of the members. And they sent undercover agents in. They used very unconstitutional ways to go to get information. And sometimes the information wasn't correct. And sometimes when they would go to arrest someone, there would be a death. The Black Panther leader, Fred Hamilton, and Mark Clark were killed by the police in 1269. In 1980, the Black Panther Party, I guess you'd say, just a shadow of its former self. Most of your former members and leaders have gone traditional. And also, the black organizations are warring against each other. Most African Americans wanted a psychological revolution, not a Marxist one. An organization called, I love this one, US or Us. It was for us as opposed to them. And they promoted African heritage. Well, that's fine. They promoted using African names. That's okay too. Learn Swahili. I don't see what good that's going to do you here, but okay. Practice African rituals and wear African clothing. And women become very subordinate. Well, the Black Panthers call this Us very reactionary. And in 1969, Us and the Black Panthers had a shootout on the UCLA campus. Well, it wasn't just a very short time after that the Us goes into a steady decline. But the irony is Malunana, however you say it, Irinaga, who was the founder of US, he also created Kwanzaa. We still celebrate Kwanzaa, folks, after Christmas in December. Now, Muhammad Ali, 22 years old, world heavyweight champion. He knew Malcolm X, and of course he became a target from all the white journalists because of his, well, he was kind of outspoken. Bless his heart. He was very, very popular among the blacks and very popular also among the white community. He was the exact opposite of Joe Louis, where Joe Louis had encouraged the black community to support the government in the war. Muhammad Ali said nope. He refused to even serve in the military because he was a member of the Nation of Islam. Well, he lost his title. He was barred from ever being in the ring, and he was out on bail for several years. But in 1971, conviction was overturned, and he regained his title. You know, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. But the culture is changing. We've got this youth culture going on among the whites. It's also going on among the blacks. You've got more blacks in predominantly white schools or universities now, and than there are everywhere before. I mean, there's still more in black universities, but the population has increased exponentially in these years. And the graduation rate was higher in the white universities that they were going to than they were in the black universities. Well, we're here at this all-white school, but we want some more stuff, so they instituted a Black Studies program. And most of them, it's like the young white students, they're joining the New Left movement, and they burn their draft cards, and they demonstrate against the war. They shout slogans, hell no, we won't go, and make love, not war. I can go along with that one. But in 68, in Orangeburg, South Carolina, which is just down the road from me, as a matter of fact, black students demonstrated against an all-whites bowling alley. And in this fray, the ruckus, 2 women were clubbed. Well, nothing was done about it then, but 2 days later, they were going to have a protest, and they've got this big bonfire, and they're standing around talking, and the police kind of, guess you'd say, raided it, and 3 students were killed. And there was absolutely nothing in the papers about it. Yet, just 2 years later, an anti-war demonstration, National Guardsman shoots into a crowd, killing 4 students. Made all the papers and the television. And this has created a lot of controversy. depending on which side of this you're on, and like your text said, most of the adults who were interviewed were very sad to see it happen, but they believed it was a demonstrator's fault, and I completely believe that. Anytime you've got a man standing in front of you with a gun, you don't throw bricks at him. He's got that gun on already. He's going to use it. And the National Guardsman was young and scared, and a crowd starts coming at him, and he's seen the rocks and the broken bottles. So it was just a tragedy. I'm sorry it happened. I really am. But never go against a guy that's got a gun. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of students, both black and white, are taking over school buildings. They're holding sit-ins, using every kind of protest that they can think of to protest the Vietnam War. And I never really understood why breaking into the president's office of a college and urinating on his desk had to do with the Vietnam War. But then I don't understand looting and riots either. So I guess I just don't understand some of these things. But because of all the mayhem that's going on, and campuses are being taken over, and you got this counterculture, you got the hippies, you got the riots, black students are going to take advantage of this situation. They begin to make more demands of their white schools. First thing they wanted was more black studies. They wanted more black professors. And the schools, because of this Equal Opportunity Act that had been passed, they wanted to conform to equal opportunity hiring practices, so more were hired, which is good and bad. I have no problem with it because sometimes you've got to give somebody some help. The racism was so rampant. I firmly believe that when you apply for a job, if I had my way about it, you'd be behind a screen with your voice disguised, so I couldn't even tell if you're a male or female. And I would look at your application and either hire you or not hire you based on what I was seeing, your qualifications and your education. Now that sounds good, but you've also got to consider you'll be working with another group of people, so your personality almost has to be taken into consideration. But I worked in a personnel department for many years and got tired of doing bookkeeping, so I transferred out. And I was thoroughly disgusted with the way it was handled. I'll give you, for instance, I worked at this one place where, although I was well, I don't know what you call it, I did the payroll and I did all the bookkeeping. I didn't really have a title. And I didn't go out to lunch, so I used to volunteer to either answer the phone during the lunch hour and give the switchboard operator a girl chance, or the receptionist, and didn't mind. And during this one particular season, we were in a position we were hiring. And there was a lot of people coming in to apply for jobs because they were looking for about 50 people. And I was sitting at her desk, and she had told me that when someone comes in and they have an application filled out, you check it to make sure it's filled out good, and when they leave, you put it in your desk. And I said, fine, dandy. She said, oh, you put the ones that are dressed nicely in the top drawer. The ones that are not dressed very good, you put in the bottom drawer. And the ones that are black, you put on the left. I was livid. So as soon as she went to lunch, I took every one of those things and messed them up, put them all in the center drawer. Yes, I did get called on the carpet for that. But even in the 20th century, this stuff was still going on. Symbol of black power, the black fist. And it seems to be going into a change. We want the black people in their culture, they want to emulate something or show their support. And they started letting the women, especially, start letting their hair go natural and into the afro. And as you can see, she's got the African beads on and also an African type blouse. And she's a beautiful girl, too. On her, it looks good. And it wasn't just black men and women wearing the afro. Our white college students also emulated them with their big hairs. And this is supposed to be a picture of a group of young black students in their big hair. Black is beautiful, yeah. And then I thought this was a man when I first picked it up, but I can see nail polish, and I know no self-respecting man would wear nail polish, but this is an African outfit. And it seemed the black women, they were kind of making a political statement, I guess you'd say, by going natural and using the afro. And most black magazines, they were even writing that the women with the afro looked unkempt and masculine. Yeah. And I just never could understand how they get to stand up that straight. Of course, the open market loved it because you got all these new products you could sell, the comb pick and all the stuff you had to do to get your hair up there. So there's money to be made. And while this is going on, are we having another Harlem Renaissance? There is a burst of creativity like you wouldn't believe. Black artists and writers and theaters and literary circles. Is there no end to these people's creativity? And each and every one of the organizations, whether it be a literary organization, a theatrical organization, or whatever, they protested in their own way. Sometimes it would be just a plain demonstration. Sometimes it would be just avoiding a certain place if you're not going to do business there anymore. It could be a fundraiser. If you were an author, you could do it in writing, or if you were a painter, you could paint. If you were a sculptor, you could sculpt. There's always a way to show your displeasure. And there was a plethora of new black magazines, and of course, Jet and Ebony are still around. And that's just two of the multitude. And I mentioned the Harlem Writers Guild primarily because Maya Angelou was a member. And I have never met this woman, but she to me is the epitome of a lady. She's soft-spoken, she's articulate, she's always immaculately dressed, and she sits there with her knees together and her hands folded in her lap and talks to you. I've seen her on Oprah, I don't know how many times. I've also read two of her books, Why the Caged Bird Sings, the story of her first 16 years of her life. I've also read her poetry. I had the distinct pleasure of being allowed to read a couple of her poems when I was in undergraduate school. But with Black is Beautiful, there seems to be a rejection of culture assimilation, as well as any organization that was for it, like the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Urban League, which wanted to help people to assimilate into the white society. And of course, Malcolm X became their hero. And all the new black writers are criticizing or rejecting the older established black writers, calling them assimilators. They're trying to link African culture to the dispersia, which is when the Jews were taken out of Israel. But the jazz even changed, and I love jazz, but I don't really care for New Orleans jazz because it's too much improvising. I want to be able to hear the melody, and I don't go this everybody doing their own thing. We also saw Alex Haley's Roots on television, and the sequel, Roots, The Next Generation, and it made quite an impact. It made a lot of people very interested in finding out their heritage. And that word, I love that word. I had to look at that word, I don't know how long before I figured out what it was. Black exploitation. Black exploitation. In other words, exploitation of the blacks. Richard Roundtree, Jim Brown, and Shaft. Movies with drugs and sex and violence, and surprise, surprise, the white audiences even liked it. And of course, the black audiences liked it. But the African American art, they painted African scenes and new images, and some used African techniques and even African equipment. And of course, they painted the black heroes. Now, Faith Ringgold is an artist that's known for her painting on canvas, as well as her making quilts and telling stories in the quilts. Toni Morrison and Maya Angelou are just two of the women that were mentioned in your text, and they came into their own in the 1970s. Toni Morrison had been just about forgotten until Oprah Winfrey brought her back in the, in the early 21st century. Alice Walker revived interest in Zora Neale Hurston, which we met during the Harlem Renaissance. She wrote an article about Miss Hurston in 1975. And people all of a sudden were interested, and she was relating the story of how she looked for her grave and all this stuff. A very interesting article. Another work you may know from Alice Walker is The Color Purple. And she received the Pulitzer for that, but the black male population was kind of outraged. They were incensed because of the portrayal of the abusive black man. And when they made the book into a movie, Oprah Winfrey played in it. But the black women writers of this time, they're bringing something new into the writing. They're bringing a new vision. They're bringing in the femininity or one of gender into the writing. But there was also a study, and I love these studies that they have in the middle of the 60s, that publicized the problem with the growing number of black female-headed homes. He gave an extremely negative characterization of the black woman as an emasculator. And the female head of the house was taking more interest in the daughters than she was the sons. And black women were a little bit angry. It's not fair characterization, it really isn't. The black woman is a very strong woman, there's no doubt about that. But that's kind of like which came first, the chicken or the egg. Was she strong because she had no man, or was being strong drove the man away? You can't generalize. Each one has to be taken individually. But the black power and feminist movements, both in full swing, and neither one seemed to be right for this new gender-conscious young woman. And then enter Angela Davis. She's born in 1944, at the end of the war, and born in Birmingham, Alabama. Now, Miss Davis became a master scholar. She studied at the Sorbonne in France. She also joined the Communist Party, and she was actually put in jail on charges of participating in a jailbreak and an attempted break and murder. She was ultimately cleared, and she's known for her books like Women, Race, and Class. She worked as a college professor, and she was an activist in the civil rights movement who advocated gender equality. She wanted prison reform, and she wanted alliances across the color lines. Look at this woman. She looks serious in her afro. See, it was during a trial in 1970 that an escape attempt was made by the men on trial, and several people in the courtroom were killed. Well, Davis was brought up on charges, including murder, because the gun that was used was hers, combined with the fact that one of the men that was trying to escape she was in love with him. And she spent about 18 months in jail, and she was finally acquitted in June of 1972 after several mistrials, where they just couldn't come up with quite enough evidence. So she returned to teaching. Now get this. Today, she is a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She teaches courses on history of consciousness. She's also written several books. And yes, there is a picture online about her way she looks today. She doesn't look a thing like that today. Of course, she's 40 years older, but she no longer has an afro. Extremely, extremely educated. And back in 1935, Mary McLeod Bethune founded the National Council of Negro Women. But by the 1960s, the young black women of the day weren't interested. This NCNW, or the National Council of Negro Women, was the voice of the middle-class black women. And it did a lot of good stuff. It formed interracial groups. It formed one called the Women in Community Service. And it worked in voter registration. It worked in the freedom schools. It worked in job corps. It helped start the Head Start program in certain areas. They're doing good work. But the young black women, they're still looking for themselves, and they're just not interested. And every time you turned around, there was another black female organization formed, and they had big ideas, but none of them ever lasted. And the white now, National Organization of Women, in their policy, they didn't include poverty. But this was a major issue for the black women. But when now offered the office as a meeting place for the National Black Feminist Organization, they jumped at it. And the NBFO, they looked at the urgent problems for their race, the child care, the OBGYN sterilization program, unemployment, education, job training, health care, and they even had the audacity to talk about lesbian sexuality among females. But not to be outdone, the black women formed a radical women's organization called the Black Women's Caucus, but they later changed the name to the Third World Women's Alliance to include Puerto Ricans. And of course, they read Marxist texts that were very leftist in their leanings. And one of their endeavors was to try to free Angela Davis. Well, of course, the Now group, this is not a feminist cause. A feminist cause is something for the women in general. And you're trying to get a girl out of prison because she doesn't need to be in prison. She's black. And they also didn't approve of all that leftist politics. And reading Marxist, But unfortunately, the unemployment, that there was massive unemployment in the black community, and it causes a decrease in participation of the black community in the economic life. In other words, they ain't got no jobs, they ain't got no money, they can't spend no money. And those that did have jobs, they were very low paying jobs. And with discrimination all over the place, they couldn't even get decent housing. And you've got that long, hot summer of 1965. Combination of discrimination, unemployment, years of frustration, being emasculated, it turned to violence. And it didn't take much of anything to start a riot. They usually began when a white policeman tried to arrest an African American. Right, wrong, or indifferent, it didn't matter. And riots broke out in the Watts area in California, in Detroit, in Jersey City, Newark, Chicago, Cleveland, and the list goes on and on and on. There'd be looting and burning and killings. In the Watts riot, 34 killed, over 1,000 injured, almost 4,000 arrested, and $14 million worth of damages. Detroit was by far the worst, 43 dead, 5,000 arrested, 500 million in damages. Newark, 26 dead, and you can go on and on. And it just seems like there's no end to it. And just when you think nothing can make anything worse, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, April the 4th, 1968. Now we've had the president assassinated, Malcolm X was assassinated, Martin Luther King is assassinated. 60s are not a good set of years. Of course, the gentleman who killed him was arrested right away, James Earl Ray. He was tried and sent to jail, and there was a crazy trial. He pleaded guilty, and there wasn't really a lot of stuff going on. And of course, the African Americans started screaming, "It's a cover-up, it's a conspiracy." And there was rioting in more than 100 cities because of it. My sister happened to be in Memphis when it happened, and she said she'd never been so scared in her entire life. But 1940 to 1970, the black population in the West and North grew to 11 million, which is 50%, over half of the total population. And they're all moving to the big cities. And it's not just in the North and West. It's Atlanta, Birmingham, Houston, Dallas, too. So the true beginning of black power, in reality, it wasn't the black fist raised. It was going to the voting polls. And we started to see more and more black men and women get elected. And there was so many congressmen in the House of Representatives that formed something called the Black Caucus. And the blacks are starting to demand more voice in the party politics. I mean, we're a large part of your voting block. You need to give us some concessions. Well, they held a convention in March of 1972, and they discussed all kinds of issues. But they couldn't get a consensus on any solution for any African American problem, especially on the one how to achieve racial equality. The problem is that by 1970, there is an ever-growing educated middle class. So there's going to be considerable evidence that the Negro community is in fact dividing between a stable middle class group that is steadily growing stronger and more successful, and an increasing disorganized and disadvantaged lower class group. That's the last sentence in your text in that chapter. That's quite the problem. But if you didn't have a lower class, you wouldn't have a middle class or an upper class. You can't have a classless society. That's too much like Marxism or socialism. A rhetorical or think question. Is it the responsibility of the successful blacks to lift up the less fortunate blacks? Think about it. I'm not going to ask that question on this particular long answer questions, but I probably will when it comes to the test. Where does your obligation to help your fellow mankind begin and end? And you've got these people who pull themselves up by their bootstraps. They've got an education, and they're really making something of themselves. Is it their responsibility to turn around and lift up the less fortunate? Next lesson, I want to explain to you something called crabs in a barrel syndrome. Thank you for listening.